So hi there, Evo. Can you hear me? But I still can't hear you. I can't hear you for some reason. Yeah, you have joined again, but can you speak? No, I can't hear you. It's very strange. It's very strange. I switched mics, not sure why the problem persists. Mic works when I test in Windows. Okay. Um, go to settings here and choose the mic. In Restream, you have the mic tab. I did. You click that and you see if you have selected the right side of mic. Just make sure if you have the right sort of mic you have. Click the arrow and make sure if you have the right sort of mic. I think that should do. Once it's added into Windows, um, you must be able to do it. Like, take your time, not a problem. There's no rush. When you add a microphone, what happens is you got to use that microphone for certain apps. Yeah, when you add a microphone in Windows, you have to go to Windows settings, microphones, and be able to use that microphone on Chrome, for example, or whatever application you're using. So go back to Windows settings and make sure that the microphone is attached to the apps such as Google Chrome or whatever application you're using.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's good now. Evo,
And
can you talk? Yep,
yes, is that
it's
working?
good.
Okay,
It's good.
good.
Yeah, okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Prophet Daniel Has Spoken Research Channel. Today, we have our second meeting with Evo on a debate on ascertaining evidence for speciation. Our previous debate was: is there scientific evidence for evolution? And that I felt was a good debate. And some of the people who watched that also told me that it was a good debate. And today it's our second meeting with Evo, and the topic for the debate today is there evidence for speciation? And welcome, Evo, and I appreciate your participation.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate it too. It's good to be back. I thought last debate was also very productive, so it's fun.
Yeah, yeah, good to know. And how do we do things today? Would you have the opening statement 5 minutes and try to go through what you've researched in the meantime and let us know your position on that?
Well, so I had the idea of because we, in the intermediate time between now and the last debate, we had some email communication. and I wanted to clarify what I think are some misconceptions that were exchanged between us, because I think this would really establish uh, what exactly the argument that we're trying to make is, and why or why not there's a valid conclusion to be made there. Does that sound fair to you?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So, because our communications after the debate kicked off when um, I had suggested to you at the end of the last debate to research the subject of monophily, and it seems like you did. And you returned to me with your opinion that sure, it's a valid classification system. I think you agree that it's a valid classification system, but it doesn't provide do anything in terms of providing scientific evidence for speciation or for what a species fundamentally is. Is this an accurate assessment of your view on the subject?
Yeah, sure.
All right,
Agree with that.
sure. Um, and so then I sort of clarified my position on that. And after we talk about your position a little bit more, I'd like to reiterate what I had sent to you after we have this discussion to see if, in light of the clarifications that we make in this discussion, that what I said previously makes more sense. So I'm just going to kind of go down the list of points that you had sent to me in email. One of the first things was a question that you asked me, and I'm just gonna read it. So you wanted to know why must, and this is quoting you, why must I grant you your claim of a scientific premise just because you have advanced a model of biodiversity? And then you go into claim that this is a straw man for the evolutionary biology worldview and is based on a false dichotomy. And then, not quoting anymore, you go on to provide what you call probable alternative explanations, such as philosophy of design. And you're saying monophyletic clades is a way for classifying the species, but that it could have been done by a designer. And again, I just before I continue, is this does this fairly represent your view?
Yeah, sure, it does.
Okay. So this is the first point slash question that I wanted to clarify, because there seems to be a misconception about why I introduced the concept of monophily. And so the first thing I want to say about it is you are right to say that monophily is not scientific evidence. It's a classification system. So it's a way of describing things. It is a rigorous way of saying what a population is and what it is not. And so
Yeah, thank you.
um,
Mm.
right, and so I agree with that, and I'd like to stress that I also agreed with that in our last interaction. Maybe that wasn't communicated well. That's fine. Um, so the reason to bring up the topic of this is because if you have a rigorous means of saying this population is this, and it is definitively not this other population, well, that means you have a means of saying, in the instance of a speciation event, that a new species is not the population that it came from. Would you say that's fair? If you have a rigorous means of testing this, then then monophily gives you a way of saying, okay, this thing is not this other thing, and so therefore you can use that as a means of testing the speciation claim.
So you're trying to summarize if a population has diverged and has evolved to become a subspecies, which you can identify using the apparatus of monophily, then you're trying to conclude what are you trying to conclude between the two populations?
So you're trying to conclude that they are not the same population anymore.
That is apparent, yeah. They're not the same
Yeah,
populations, yeah.
yeah. So
But yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
I'd like to hear your question.
So my what I would say here is the differentiation that has occurred between the two populations could be explained via evolutionary biology and the premises of natural selection, or it could be explained via other design philosophies for creation.
Yes,
So there can
I
be a
agree.
number of different participants here or claimants who can go on to explain or provide explanation of that, right?
Yes,
So if we are going with the scientific explanation, um, like a, which is not really a design philosophy, but an explanation that's rooted in scientific evidence. then we need to see evidence or explanations of how this speciation or how these two populations diverged based on the assumptions and premises of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. So all of those tools of natural selection must be used to explain the actual phenomenon, the actual drift between the two populations.
So everything you just said, I actually completely agree with. And the point of monophyly was not to disagree with any of that. It was only to
Yeah.
establish a premise for how you can do an experiment to test a hypothesis. So I was not actually forwarding via monophyly the conclusion of evolution by common descent. I was only saying that this is a rigorous means of saying that this thing is not this other thing, right? So in order to even test the conclusion of common descent, you need monophyly as a concept to do that. And so that was the only conclusion of the argument I was making there. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's how even I understood that to mean, and I wouldn't necessarily understand that to mean any more than what you have just agreed with me right now. And
Perfect.
yeah, there is an agreement there. And I wanted to clarify something about the UV radiation that was hitting the Earth. So I was of the opinion, like I had some this because I wrote a book. In that book, I explained the earthly skies, and in that, a big part of that was how the atmosphere is bulged on the equator. So I had the same impression that even ozone is bulged at the equator, but which is not, it is not. So a quick checkup revealed that ozone actually amasses itself in greater thickness at the poles and it's thinner at the equator, so it lets more UV in at the equator. So I wanted to provide that clarification also, as well. So
Okay, for sure.
yeah. Okay, so we can proceed. So we can proceed now in
Yeah, so it seems like we've
understanding.
clarified this first point. Okay, so I'm just gonna go down the email list.
Go
So
on, go ahead.
next, yeah. So next question, and I'm just gonna quote from you again. What you are doing is post hoc idealizing in favor of evolutionary theory, and I think based on the previous conclusion, we came to an understanding that uh, that that's not what's going on. So I hope we agree there.
Yeah,
Next, observations are not necessarily telling of their common ancestor unless proven to be the case. So this is something that I want to clarify as well. And I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to read the argument that this particular sentence from you, I think, is attempting to address. So I had made an argument in a formal syllogism, right, with premises and a conclusion. And I'm going to read that argument, and I want you to tell me what your interpretation of the argument is and what your thoughts are on it. So I'm just going to read it. The argument goes as follows. Premise one: if a group is monophyletic, then the heritable traits they all exclusively have in common must have been shared by a common ancestor who also had those traits. Premise 2: a given group X is monophyletic. Conclusion: therefore, that group X had a common ancestor whose characteristics define that group X. What are your thoughts on that?
so my understanding of this yeah, this theorem, right? You're getting at a theorem now. You are saying if this is the case, then it should entail in it should entail in something else, right? So the theorem that you're bringing to the table actually has a uh, contradictory understanding within the evolution um, understanding. For example, so evolution argues that a sequential but small and elementary changes add up over a period of time, and there is a uh, g- there is a set of genes that have undergone transformation or mutations acted by positive forces towards positive evolution, and they eventually turn out to become a new species. And when they acquire those new traits in that evolutionary trajectory, they necessarily um, erase or shred the parental traits. Some of the parental traits are not carried forward and they are not expressed obviously they're not expressed in genetic makeup, but they are not also left in the genetic imprint as vestiges of those initial parental or ancestral impressions in their genomes. You don't find them in their genomes. So when you don't find such trajectories of ancestral remnants of those ancestral phenotypic traits in the evolving um, populations, so how can you, even though you might have categorized monophyly based on some prominent traits or phenotypic traits, but those details that go missing in the genome, how can you then be sure of their ancestral descent?
This is
How
a
can
great
you
question.
establish that bridge?
First thing, based on the last thing that you just said, I'm not claiming certainty of their descent based on an evidentiary claim. The second thing I want
Okay.
to address is the argument that you just presented is not an evidentiary argument, but you're claiming that there exists a contradiction, right? And so in my response, I'm not going to provide evidence. I'm going to provide why it's not a contradiction. So I just want that to be understood. So if I understand the argument you made um, correctly, you're saying that due to entailments of evolution, there are mutations where ancestral traits are lost, and so they don't have traces of them, and so therefore you can't use um, the traits that have been lost to tie it to the common ancestor. Is this sort of the gist of the argument?
That's one of the arguments, yeah.
Okay. And you're saying that this, and because of this, this entails, because evolution entails this, that there is an internal contradiction happening here. So the first thing I would say is monophyly defines a population on on the basis of the traits that they do have in common. And it's not just the ones that they have in common, but it's the things that only the members of that population have in common. And what we find is um, it is possible to do this with any two populations on Earth. There's always overlap. There's always at least 40, 40 to 50% overlap among eukaryotes, for example. And so there isn't this annihilation of I'm going to put in quotes because I'm not going to beg the question and assume that they're ancestral, but I'm just saying within evolution, there is not entailed a contradiction by that because there is not the annihilation of all of the ancestral traits, particularly for closely related species. So if you have closely related species and you observe a speciation event, they're going to be mostly the same genetically. They're only going to differ. They're only going to differ on these particular loci that have fixated between the two of them. And so I'm not seeing the contradiction that you're implying.
So the contradiction really is, let me articulate it in this way. The contradiction would mean that the inference that we would draw of a common ancestor, how do you link it up? I do know that you're not approaching this from the evidentiary point of view. Like,
I'll give you an example.
yeah,
So let's give an example of two populations where you can establish definitively on the basis of monophyly that one is not the is not the ancestor of the other one. So let's say for example, you can take dogs and humans. And typically, so when you observe speciation, right, you always see this branching pattern. You see divergence in this way, and then another divergence in this way. And so you always see you see a branching pattern, and you see a nested hierarchy, right? So in observed cases of speciation, the descendant to new species exists in a nested hierarchy with the parent species that they came from. Now, between if you take just the populations of dogs and humans, it is not possible via monophyly to construct a nested hierarchy in which humans are nested within dogs or in which dogs are nested within humans. So therefore, monophyly entails it is possible that either one of these is the ancestor of the other one. But what I'm saying is, so that would be the first example, is there are these test cases where you can say, because of monophyly, you can rule out an ancestral relationship between these two populations. However, all of life does exist in a nested hierarchy. And so if you go at a high enough taxa, and so um, basically because of that, the contradiction that you're implying doesn't exist because between any two populations, you can construct a monophyletic clade. on the basis of the traits of the heritable traits that they all have in common and only they have in common.
Yeah, at this point in time, it can be deduced to be that case. I mean, you can deduce that case as a valid concept to work with. But unless there is established evidence of common descent, it will just remain an assertion, and to build evidence based on that assertion would be a contradiction. Like, for example, the very
I'm not
claim,
doing that, by the way. But
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, the very claim now needs to be substantiated. Like, there is a claim of common ancestral parents resulting in diverging offspring. um, there has to be a scientific evidence. There has to be a way in which science can go on and demonstrate common
Of course.
ancestry.
Agree.
So why don't we just focus on this area of the debate and see what level of evidence there is at this point in time in science, to usher us, the qualitative um, edge of this theory of evolution to be something that people have uh, to respect, to come and uh, you know um,
Okay.
become participants in knowing about it more. So, what
Okay.
kind of qualitative evidence does science provide us in this area?
Yeah, so I'm happy to move forward the conversation to this subject, but first I just want to make sure. So we agree that the monophyly argument is a valid argument formally, and we also agree that it is a valid means of classifying populations. Do we agree on both of these points?
I agree on classification side of it. I mean, it can be a valid um, compartment, where we have compartmentalized all the species into different branches. And we can also develop this going into the future. We might come across many new things, and we can develop this branch of separating different taxas in the tree of biodiversity. I mean, I agree with that. But what's the argument? What's the other argument that you're trying to impress with this monophyly?
The other one was the logical syllogism that I presented. I'm just trying to make sure that we agree that now that I've clarified it, that I've cleared the logical contradiction that you were trying to suggest. Because there's no point in talking about evidence if it's premised on a methodology which is logically incoherent, right? So we have to establish that the logic of it is coherent first.
Yeah, I can grant that, to work around, to actually seeing if there is evidence. So
Sure, perfect. Okay,
yeah, we can work with it. I mean, I have no issues in, if we have found evidence and that goes on to substantiate the syllogism that you're bringing to the table, then it will be complementary evidence on uh,
right.
for that particular thing. But if there
Yes,
is no evidence, then it only remains an assertion, and to from there to go on build evidence would be a contradiction. So
perfect. So let's go into then, because I think last time we talked, you had agreed that speciation is an observable phenomenon, but you had disagreed that there is a genetic basis for it. Can you remind me sort of what you meant by that, but by a genetic basis for speciation?
yeah, for example, I would give you this example, right? Let's go to Drosophila, the fruit flies again. The fruit flies, there are four species that were researched by, even the article that you presented here. Jerry A. Cohen is the one who advanced it after the 1840s fallout, I suppose, or 1940s fallout. Researchers who were researching fruit fly sort of gave up on speciation, but Jerry A. Cohen comes along after 40 years and reinvigorates the project, and makes some groundbreaking makes some groundbreaking progress into it. And this is the guy whose book I read also. So he deals with these fruit flies a lot more, and he goes on to explain there are four subspecies of these fruit flies. Two of those are cosmopolitan, that they are found everywhere on Earth, and they are Melanogaster and Simulans. The other two species are endemic to certain islands on the Madagascar, One of them is Seychelles, and the other one is Mauritiana, if I'm pronouncing them correctly. So what happens is these two of those are global, two of those are endemic, but one of those global species, simulants, interacts or interbreeds successful fertile females with the endemic species, Seychelles or Martiana, but does not end up in a fertile male. The concept in biology, they determine it to be called as a parental leakage. But they do end up giving birth to fertile female offspring, and much of that is not even genetics. It's dictated by the egg cytoplasm. All right, that might be something interesting there. So it's not even captured in genetics. It's
Is
the
egg
magic comes from.
cytoplasm determined by genetics?
Oh, you could argue that, but there is a gray zone there, and there's a lot going on there. But which okay, we might talk about it in the future episode.
Okay.
All right, but now coming back to the point that simulants, which is a cosmopolitan subspecies, does have fertile females with the two endemic fruit flies species in the islands of Madagascar, but not so much the melanogaster. The melanogaster does not yield in the same result when crossed with the subspecies found endemic to those islands of Madagascar. Also, that melanogaster does not even result in fertile offspring with simulants, which is also a cosmopolitan subspecies. So the two cosmopolitan subspecies do not result in a fertile female, right? And melanogaster doesn't even result in a fertile female with the endemic subspecies. So it's very different out of the four. Melanogaster is very different, although being a cosmopolitan subspecies. So that's where the difficulty that's where the difficulty arises for evolution. If barriers are an evolutionary means of causing speciation, how would you go on to explain what or what became the barrier between the
Okay.
melanogaster and the simulants that are cosmopolitan? Although you could argue some of the phenotypic differences may themselves have become a genetic barrier, the barrier need not be a geographical barrier as such, but the barriers can also function based on genetics alone. Well, I can grant you that, but their nature being cosmopolitan, always populations have interacted. What I mean, there should be one of an event that has shot or became a barrier, which is a agenda driven um, presupposition to argue over with respect to these two cosmopolitan subspecies of the fruit flies. So these are the sort of difficulties that you are dealing with in explaining speciation among these four um, fruit fly subspecies. Two are endemic and two are cosmopolitan. How would you tackle this? Go ahead.
Okay, and I want to make sure that I'm steelmanning the position again.
Yeah.
So my understanding is you're, for the sake of argument, you are granting the genetic distinction, and then you are asserting that evolution claims that it is geographic barriers which lead to speciation, but we have these two species that share that share an environment, and yet they seem to be the most different ones out of all of the subspecies. How does evolution account for this? Is this the challenge that you're giving me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
okay, perfect. Okay. So we've documented so the barrier type of speciation. This is called allopatric speciation. So like in nature, this would be like I don't know, like let's say a river like runs through the territory of a population. It wouldn't apply to flies, but just as an example, a river goes through them, and so they're the barrier makes it so they can't cross with each other. And so any mutations inherited by one will not be inherited by the other one. And if any of those mutations make them infertile with each other, well, that's going to result in speciation. So that's allopatric speciation. This is the one that is the easiest to simulate in the lab. You just separate them. The other ones we've even observed on what is called sympatric speciation. This is when literally you have a population, they live in the same environment. There's no barrier whatsoever. There's not even really there's not even really like a food barrier or anything. Um, but what happens is the species sort themselves behaviorally. So you get this like cliquishness within the species where by the choices that they make, they only breed with certain types. And this can cause what is called a sympatric speciation. There's no barrier involved. They just, by choices that they make in successive generations, they reproductively isolate themselves. And you can even have a situation where um, after they've speciated, they still continue to live in the same relative local environment, but over time, there's going to be like territorial drawings. They're going to increasingly sexually select for only specific kinds. So I guess one of the more common ways would be like sexual selection. So just to use like a super simplistic example, let's say let's say there's color variation in the species, and they develop a sexual preference for only opposite sex, which are the same color as them. And so this would be an example of sympatric speciation, and it's been documented in the wild and also in the lab, sympatric speciation.
Yeah, don't you think it's overly simplified at this point in time just to support the agenda of evolutionary biology? Because the
Well,
practicality
it
of the
supports the
situation,
very narrow claim that genetic speciation can occur without a geographic barrier.
yeah, I mean, we understand this. Like I told you, this example of these different subspecies of fruit flies. Two are endemic to Madagascar, and two are cosmopolitan. So the ones who are cosmopolitan still, one of them still has fertile females with the endemic subspecies, where you don't expect that to unravel. You don't expect that to entail in fertile species. You expect one would expect naturally expect for the two cosmopolitan to have fertile females and uh, to avoid paternal leakage, non-fertile males, but you don't expect that to occur with those endemic species to the islands of Madagascar because there has been this barrier for quite some time. For how many ever millions of years you want to portray that to be the case. But the cosmopolitan subspecies have always shared the environment, as you've said. So now, to I mean, the some of the research that has resulted, what's the outcome of those research that Jerry Equine performed is there has to be this at least what has been noticeable is 100 different loci being mutated, or and alleles have been found in 100 different set of genes that has gone on to determine infertile or fertile or infertile males populations in the cross breeding of those two different species. So at least 100 different genetic alleles would take like a half a million years of timeline, according to
Yeah,
what they
that's what they
jolt
say.
out the
Yeah,
numbers over there. So half a million years is a lot of time for these populations that were cosmopolitan, for example, Madagascar and simulants, interacting with each other in the same environment. Half a million years is a lot of time um, for them to be not interacting based on preferences. Like, I mean, we humans also have preferences. Like, we like certain females we like females from certain cultures, or whatever, what and what not be the case. But there is also other determinisms. Not every female that I like from a different culture would be willing to marry me. I mean, um, I would be more so, will more so. Uh, having more chances to find a mate within a population where I may not necessarily have a preference, for example. So there might be a population where there is mates willing to mate with me. I might not be having the same willingness to mate with them, but there is so many other determinants in the environment that go on to shape the mating process.
sure.
So to argue over a case where there has been a preference made by some population not to mate with a larger population is is not a
I can give you a
strong
more
premise
concrete
to argue
case.
from.
I can give you a more
Sorry.
concrete case where it's less abstract than just like talking about colors and sexual preference. There's one famous study done. I think it was actually on fruit flies also, and this was in the wild, and it had to do with so like there's this one species which is endemic to, I think it was like literally a single tree. So there's this apple tree, and the species is endemic to that one tree. And what happens is and it's an apple tree. What happens is there is this neighboring tree that has slightly different apples on it, and what they observed was that some of the species developed a preference for the apples on the other tree, and they even developed a preference for laying their eggs on that tree. And so here you have a case of these of these developing of two populations based on these trees that are right next to each other. But because the new ones are developing a preference for this different tree, for this different fruit, for laying their eggs, for mating exclusively on this tree versus this other tree, there's no physical reason why they can't fly to the other tree and interact with each other. It's based on their preferences of the tree and of the fruit itself that actually resulted in speciation. And this is a concrete example of something that has actually happened and has actually been observed.
Again, there is a tremendous amount of simplification there because that requires the apple trees evolution themselves to have come about at the same time as that of the evolution of those fruit flies. So this is a overly simplistic model where you kind of do this post hoc rationalizing of two simultaneous things unraveling in real time scenario where speciation really occurs with the apples as well as occurs with the fruit flies at the same time. So these are the simplistic um, um,
What is the post
f-
hoc part? The fact that speciation has occurred?
the post hoc part is when we now look at this scenario in the wild, we see certain fruit flies are attracted to um, a particular species of an apple, and they're fond of that species of an apple tree. And there's other set of flies that are attracted to a different, say, for example, the green apple, and they coalesce themselves, they huddle themselves around that tree, a green apple tree and a red apple tree, for example. So we see the scenario entail in front of us, and then we go back and do rationalizing. Oh, this is how they this explains speciation between them and also between the two apple trees, and they have had this convergent evolution in their own respective domains of taxa, plant and animal life, and this is how things have unraveled.
I'm
A
not
much
seeing
better
the
example
connection
could be
there.
this bee, an orchid bee that has developed its sexual organs to match up with the patterns of flowers on the orchid plant. So to
I
now
disagree.
this is a very so sorry.
I don't think that's a direct comparison at all. I don't think that works as an analogy. The bee and the flower are an example of symbiosis, which is an argument you can make if you want, but I would say it's not analogous to the tree thing. I'm not saying that the fly has a symbiotic relationship with the tree, or that the tree benefits at all from having the fly on it. We're just saying that the fly has a preference for this other thing in the environment, which is right next to the original thing in the environment. I don't see how there's any connection to the independent existence of the tree or the independent origin of the tree. I see that as independent. I don't see how there's any necessary
Okay,
connection between the
got
evolution
you,
of the tree and the evolution of the fly.
got you. Even if I want to treat this as an independent case where these flies separated or drifted away from into two different populations based on the preference that some flies had to a particular tree, um, that again is, I mean, then you have to go and demonstrate just the preference of hovering over a particular tree type would necessarily result in speciation. Like, just
It did.
you're asserting it did because you find that to be the case, and you this is what is post hoc rationalizing. You because you find things of that nature, you would assert, oh, that's the reason why speciation really occurred. But what you would not do is go and explain why would that preferential feeding habit necessarily result in speciation, and what kind of speciation, how would that trigger a set of a series of mutations that would go on to define speciation,
Okay.
is what you
I
have
think
to is what you
I
have
think
to
this I
provide
think this
evidence
is a
for.
fair question. However, I
Yeah.
think it is changing the goalpost a little bit because in the question about sympatric speciation, I think you granted for the sake of argument that if there exists an actual barrier that you can say that this justifies that speciation has occurred when there's an actual barrier. But what's relevant about a physical barrier being created? What's relevant about it is that a fertility barrier has artificially been created. Well, in sympatric speciation, the same thing is happening. What's relevant about it is that there has been a fertility barrier that has occurred. So the actual like geographic space that divides two populations is what matters. It's the effect of it. The effect of it is that it causes them to not exchange genes with each other anymore. And so what I'm saying is, here's an example where there isn't a geographic barrier, but they're not exchanging genes anymore. And so by that epistemic standard of speciation, you'd be able to say that speciation has occurred. Now, if you want to ask me a further question about, well, what justifies why the fly, like how does evolution justify that the fly developed this new preference in the first place? That's a fair question, but that's secondary to the point that I'm making.
Uh, what would be primary to the point that you're trying to make is that we find some species of fruit flies liking a particular tree, and that could be just an observation from our limited time scale of looking at things. And for us to make an assumption that that's been always the case is what I'm trying to
Can you
question. So that
explain
may
what's
not be
different
always,
about
that may not be a case that's always happened in going back to millions of years, for example.
Can you explain what's different between this and between allopatric speciation on the basis of geography?
So as I said, the subspecies, um, the Seychelles and Mauritiana, who are endemic to some of the islands of Madagascar, right? So you would call that allopatric speciation because they are isolated to those islands.
Okay.
All right. So then you have this what is the word?
Sympatric.
Sympatric. Then you have the sympatric speciation that's based on um, be, genetic barriers being a source of not interacting between non-interaction between two different populations that still go on to share the same environment. So that's the case with melanogaster and simulants. They have shared the same environment, but they have not interacted sexually, and they have had genetic isolation based on preferential some of their preferences, which are, again, are abstract, and we can't really pull out scientifically testable, verifiable claims for why those preferences necessarily result in speciation. But okay, granted that that does occur, my inquiry would be, what is the evidence that those preferences, for example, the fruit flies that hover on a particular apple tree, feed nectar from that tree or whatever it is, or feed of the fruit of the tree, why would a change in diet necessarily assure in new phenotypic traits that would go on to define speciation between other populations who just preferred to feed off from a different apple tree, for example?
So I think there are two questions in here. The first one is why would the ones on the other tree have different traits than the one on the first tree, right? And so the answer to that question is the same reason they would have different traits if there is allopatric speciation, which is they are inheriting mutations that are not being inherited by the other one, right? And so it's the exact same thing as allopatric. It's just that there's a barrier. The other question is, well,
And then
why
again,
would
I want to just stop you there. I want to just stop you there, just for an inquiry.
Mhm.
You are again defining an allopatric barrier because you are assuming that the fruit flies never interacted with the neighboring tree fruit flies who had a different preference. This is an assumption, and what this does not answer is the preferential behavior actually caused a social behavior. A preferential eating behavior actually caused a social behavior of being exclusive.
Yes, so this is the second question of yours that I was referring to, right?
Yeah.
So that
Okay.
was just answering the first part, and then what you just brought up is the second question that needs to be addressed. Um, and so it's not just feeding behavior; it's also a reproductive preference. So they live their entire life on this other apple tree, and they have a preference for mating on it. They also have a preference for laying their eggs on it, and they never well, and it could be the case that there's some interaction and maybe there is some gene flow between them. But let's say a male from the new one goes back to the original population and he mates with one in the original population. Well, the eggs from his sperm are going to be laid on the original tree, and they're going to be recirculated back. But all of the ones that didn't do that, that's not going to happen. So there could be in the intervening time before speciation has occurred, there could be one member who just goes back. But what's happening here is the females on each tree have a preference for laying their eggs on one and living their entire lifespan on one tree versus the other one.
I'm sure you're also aware of this. What is this called? Um, just bear with me. Polyploidy. You're aware of
Yes.
it? Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. So we do have species with polyploidy. Um, Let me just read something that I wrote down here for you, so
Because it's
you
mostly
can
about
you can.
plants, right? It's like mostly
Yeah,
like plant
yeah, they're
speciation
also
has
they're
a lot to
also
do with
they're also with
polyploidy.
animals. They're also with animals. Like for example, here, just bear with me. So those toads and polyploid salamanders are not reproductively isolated due to polyploidy alone. They create a polyploid mosaic within the same reproductive network. So polyploidy actually brings in a lot of genes together, basically duplicates it or whatever it is. So there's a lot more gene repertoire in the cells that goes on to determine um, what a species looks like. For example, what we are trying to argue from diverging populations is a small set of genes that are mutating. So in comparison to polyploidy, polyploidy has a larger chunk of the genes with them within the populations that are different, for example. So the case of the salamander and toads that have polyploidy, they still are a single species because the polyploid mosaic within the same reproductive network is proliferated. It doesn't necessarily result in um, subspecies just because a set of genes are different, for example. But I do understand that polyploidy could, I mean, there has to be the chances that polyploidy should result in subspecies is substantially more, statistically more, because they are carrying a large chunk of replicated genes as compared to the diploid cells of other animal species, for example. So they're having limited number of genes to work around with as compared to these species who are polyploid in nature, who have replicated set of genes. So the chances of speciation to occur with polyploidy are substantially more, even on projections, statistical projections, than as compared to species that are haploid or diploid, for example, in nature. So, but what we do find is they are not subspecies. They have this mosaic of polyploidy being circulated in their reproductive network. So, the argument that these small set of mutations that happen with these diverging species necessarily evolves into a preferential reproductive network which the species adheres to is a agenda driven evolutionary argument. I would necessarily argue it that way rather than we finding evidence of how come this simulants, who is a global cosmopolitan species of fruit flies, still results in a fertile female with an endemic fruit fly species on the islands of Madagascar, and not a fertile offspring with Melanogaster, who's also a cosmopolitan subspecies. So things are not rosy here for evolutionary biologists to sort of even furnish rationality, not let alone genetic evidence of how this speciation really occurs. Not even genetics, just rationalizing the concept that allotropic or sympatric speciation has occurred is it on itself is a big thing over millions of years. So you are trying to
Sure.
determine based on a timely observation here. I mean, we have been observing these things to happen, say, 150 years now. That some flies have had a preferential outlook to their lives. They've had some preferences in terms of feeding, in terms of copulating, and socializing. But this observation is very recent and very limited. Let's say, for example, 150 years in terms of what we observe of these Drosophila, right? And our observations have only improved over a period of time because now we are armed with technology which we did not have, say, 50 years ago. So this limited observation, and then to conflate it and expand it to millions of years, you know what amount of assumptions go into it? There's tremendous assumptions going into it.
Okay,
And
so there's a lot to address here.
we are conflating things out of proportion, and then we are going on and saying those initial preferences of those fruit flies actually ended up in subspecies of those kinds. That's a gigantic argument.
All right, so there's a lot to address here, and some of these arguments are evidentiary arguments, and some of them are logical coherence arguments. On the issue of polyploidy, so not only is it statistically more likely to result in speciation, it's also observationally more likely to result in speciation. And when we talk about speciation, well, really, it's just when these two populations who were previously interfertile no longer breed anymore, right? And so this is separate from the question of whether there is a genetic basis for the speciation, right? I think we agree that even if there is no genetic basis, there is a basis for saying that speciation has occurred in this population because, again, speciation is just these two populations don't breed anymore. Now, as for the genetic basis for it, in terms of polyploidy, again, we do observe that polyploid species are more likely to speciate. The fact that some of them do not result in speciation or they result in these viable polyploid populations, it does not entail a contradiction there. You'd have to show me where the contradiction lies there. Also,
Why wouldn't it would be my question? Why wouldn't they necessarily result in
more likely
contradiction?
to does not mean necessary to. So,
But statistically speaking,
and also when we're talking about a genetic basis for speciation, again, um, this is different from saying speciation has occurred. So, so the claim is not okay. You have a polyploid species, therefore this is the genetic basis for speciation, but speciation hasn't occurred. This is looking at it backwards. Speciation has occurred, and then you need to look at if there's a genetic basis for causing hybrid infertility, right? And so in either the case of allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation, you have genetic loci that you can identify that results in hybrid incompatibility. And so it's not whether it's polyploid or diploid or haploid. It's do these genes result in hybrid incompatibility and has occurred. In the case of the toads or whatever example you gave, speciation has not occurred, and there is no genetic basis for hybrid incompatibility. In the case of sympatric speciation has occurred, and there's also a genetic basis for speciation.
yeah, I mean, I don't see why would you would assert there is genetic evidence for speciation in terms of a sympatric speciation, other than just an observation that which we have made, right? So
Question, question. Do you grant that there's a genetic basis in allopatric speciation?
no, I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So then we need to define what genetic speciation is, because in my view, genetic speciation is when you identify genes that cause effects that cause hybrid sterility or hybrid infertility. Would this not be a genetic basis for speciation in your view?
Well, that is a fact. How we would see two things are different species is the way that they can't reproduce a successful fertile outcome, right? So if they're not,
Well, it's not the way; it's just the fact that they don't
yeah,
reproduce, right?
yeah,
that's irrespective of whether there's a genetic justification for it, right? Speciation is a lower bar to meet than the genetic
Yeah,
than the
for the
genetic
mere fact that they
justification.
are not
It's
able
just
to
saying they
produce,
don't breed anymore, and that's
for the mere
speciation.
fact that they're not able to produce a fertile offspring would necessarily tell you that they're different species. I would agree with that. That is the
Okay.
case.
Okay.
Um, what I want to know is like how I would explain that is like from the design philosophy, it was meant to be the case, and God coded those differences so they don't interact to produce fertile offsprings going forward, right? So
Does
I
that
would
explanation grant that there's a genetic basis for it and that just the genetics are caused by God
I
or the
mean,
designer?
God does do genetics, for example. I mean, that's how he brings about species and creation, right?
So this isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying there seems to be a contradiction in the standard because you're holding the evolutionary view to saying, well, there needs to be a genetic basis for speciation, but then you're saying under the design view there is a genetic basis for speciation, unless I misunderstand you there.
I'm not saying that in the design view there's a genetic basis for speciation. What I'm saying is there is a genetic detriment that's two species don't interact to produce fertile offspring. So that detriment can be best explained. What I'm basically projecting here is the God of the gaps kind of situation, if you can correlate to it. So, from the scientific point of view, you would argue if we can explain things, then we don't need the God anymore because we've explained it
Hmm.
and we know how it happened, right? But I don't necessarily argue that premise to be a true premise. I could say we can explain things and still, God is not taken out of the equation. God still remains in the equation. But for the sake of argument, I can say that assumption that you have explained it, it's still not satisfactory. You haven't really explained it. That would be my argument, right?
So my question is, we need to define what genetic basis for speciation is then. So you said that there could be a what you called a genetic detriment. What is the definitional difference between a detriment and a genetically different species? What's the difference?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have any problems to agree that breeding fertile offsprings would be that difference.
No. So I'm talking about the definition of what you called a genetic detriment, which you said could exist, and a genetic basis for speciation, which seems to be in contention in your view. So why is one in contention and the other is not? Why can we say that there's a genetic detriment but not genetic speciation?
Okay, I mean, the reason being that we don't see a trajectory of genetic evidence to have really resulted in speciation unless we supplement it with a lot of statistical
I'm going to
simplifications
need a
and assumptions.
definition of genetic speciation and genetic detriment separately. Can you give me two definitions, one for genetic detriment and one for genetic speciation, that explains
I
why they're
might take
different?
I might take some time and write that down for you, the
Sure,
definitions.
sure.
Okay,
Because in
so
my
that'll
view,
be
I'm not seeing
something.
the difference, and so it seems that by the challenge that you're providing me, they're the same thing. And so if we grant one, we have to grant the other one. Now, of course, you can table that, and we can come back to it. But that's where I stand as I see it at this point in the conversation.
Mm. There's one thing that I wanted to clarify with you. I think it's time for me to have this discussed with you here. Is in the article that you gave me, I read there's hybrid incompatibility genes such as ODS, odds, HMR, and LHR have regulatory functions. Can you expand your understanding on that?
Yeah. So, well, I'm going to tie this to what I think your view is. So, I think your view is that there are these phenotypic traits, such as you brought up like the egg cytoplasm thing earlier, or some sort of like structural thing in the body. Um, I don't remember exactly what they referred to in the article in terms of what did you call it? Functions. What kind of functions?
Regulatory functions,
Regulatory functions. Okay, so this would have to do with like
physiology.
interact. Physiology, exactly. So it's just the way. Well, so regulatory functions could be physiology, or it could also be the way that the like proteins in the cell actually like create structures. I know it's kind of vague, but like regulatory could refer to something in the physiology, or it could refer to something like at the cellular level, like the way that the cell does work. And I know I understand that that's vague, but my understanding of that isn't like super dense either. So that's why. Why
Yeah, I
why do you
mean,
ask?
if yeah, because I mean, these are the results that Jerry Coyne has put out, for example, or his team of researchers. So if the speciation is really determined by regulate regulatory functions and not so much with anatomical variations of the species, like so if physiology is the one that goes on determines why species speciate or diverge, then most of the observations that we draw upon species that are phenotypical in nature, that are anatomical in nature, anatomical variations such as how we go on and classify monophyly and clades,
Hmm.
would then be having consequences, because if we are determining speciation to occur from a regulatory functions from the what is the
Physiology.
word, physiology, from the physiology side of the story, if we are approaching speciation from that side of the story and not necessarily through variations in anatomies, then I mean, I'm sure, I mean, as evolutionary biologists, would one would argue those two interact in resulting in a successful subspecies, or a diverging population. They two have to necessarily interact, and physiology is not the only area where speciation would occur, or necessitate speciation to occur. But then if that is the case, if that is what this research has entailed, like odds and HMR and LHR to have regulatory functions, if that's what the research is pointing at, then the syllogism that you brought to the table about monophyly uh, really loses its basis.
I'm not understanding how. So we're saying that there are these genes which have fixated in one of the species, and these other genes that have fixated in the other species, and they can't mate because when the genes combine, it results in a collapse of regulatory functions. And so I'm not understanding the contradiction to monophyly, because the monophyly basis for them being separate species is one has this gene, another one has this gene. And it's
Yeah,
not
and then,
possible to reintroduce the genes back in terms of backflow.
I mean, I can see where you're coming from, but if let's boil down to subspecies that are closer in taxa. Let's come back to the example of the fruit flies. So we don't necessarily see apparent differences, although they are microscopic. We do see them. Like if we go into the microscopes and see these different subspecies of fruit flies, you might see some features, genitalia being slightly larger or different between the fruit flies and everything. But that may be anatomical. I mean, I would argue that those are anatomical variations, phenotypical
I would
variations.
agree.
But how much of that has been regulatory differences between those fruit flies? How much? What sort of regulatory? I mean, what does the research entail here? The odds and HMR and LHR. Can you give me an internal review
Well,
of what
yeah.
those
So,
differences
well,
are?
so the entailment is premise one: speciation has occurred. Premise two: the reason that they can't breed anymore is because of these regulatory functions. And yes, it's possible for speciation to occur via another means. This is just the way that they observed it in these particular cases, was they have these incompatible regulatory functions. And premise three is that that they identified which genes are causing those regulatory functions. So we have a genetic cause for hybrid sterility, which means we have a genetic cause for speciation. That's the entailment.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get that because I kind of guessed it beforehand that that would be a probable answer that would come out from a biologist. But yeah, nonetheless, nothing of this is pointing at this point in time, even in that research, that there is genetic evidence for speciation. Well, these are differences that we have noticed in sequencing their genomes, that
Again,
these
in order to
subspecies
make
to
this
have.
argument, I'm going to need you to define genetic speciation, right? And I think you said you were going to table that. So in order to make that argument, you first have to give me what genetic speciation is and how it's different from genetic detriment.
I'll try to table something, but what I meant when I use those, basically, you're you're asking me a definition. I was using those phrases to communicate my point of view, but I'll try to pen down something for you.
Well, I'll tell you why I need a definition because I need to know what your standard of evidence is, so that way I can meet it, right? If I don't
Okay.
know what you mean by genetic speciation, then I can't give you what it is.
Mm.
I can give you my definition, and I think I provided that existing, right?
So, what I would like to ask you is this that the I mean, time and again I come back to fruit flies because those are the genomes that we have researched quite in depth, and those are the smallest of the genomes that we have to work around with. If we migrate to different species, the genome size just explodes. So fruit flies are just 8 chromosomes and 8 sets of chromosomes, and it's quite smaller to work around. And it's been thoroughly researched all along, and still undergoing significant research. So, how would you? I mean, even if you want to just focus on sympatric speciation, what are the findings from from these melanogaster and simulants that they have had preferential social distinctions from one another that has shaped them into different species?
Okay,
What are the
so you
takeaways? What
want
are the findings? What are the takeaways?
so you want in their specific story, what is their analogy to the apple tree thing? Is that the question?
Yeah,
What
what
is
are the
their
learnings?
specific
What are
apple
the
tree?
findings? What have
Um,
been the findings in regards in relation to those subspecies of fruit flies?
for those specific species, unfortunately, I don't know. I can give you a general example like the apple, but for those specific ones, I'd have to look it up. So I can't answer that on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the futuristic discussions that we would have with each other, I would be super curious to latch on to the leads that provide us information and a clear trajectory of pathway where we can rationalize and
Yeah.
even see the loci dance with those predictions of
I
how
just came up
they.
with I came up with a possibility, and this, of course, is not evidence. This is just something that I made up, right? So I'm admitting that up front. But one possibility that I just thought of is the population today is cosmopolitan, but they might not have been in the past. So it could be that both of them were independently so successful that they spread globally, but by the time that they re-interacted with each other, they had speciated via allopatric speciation in the intervening time. Now, again, this isn't evidence. I just made this up, but this just sounds like a possibility to me, and maybe when we research it, we'll find that that's what happened.
No, that could very well be the possibility, but so far the research does not point at that direction. The research sort of corroborates the idea that they have been cosmopolitan ever since.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'd have to look it up then to see what exactly the
I mean, yeah,
explanation is,
I can
or even
grant
if
you
there
that.
is one.
I can grant you that even as a just a study, I can grant you that, and we can even actually look into simulants and one of the species that's endemic to the islands of Madagascar, Mauritiana or Seychelles. So we can see how these two species have had allopatric timelines, millions of years when they speciated differently, and then when they are interacting right now, they are able to produce fertile offspring, female fertile offspring, and still we can investigate and see what have been the preferential. I mean, in this particular case, there is not so much about preferences, but because they have been endemic to one particular island, what necessarily did not entail in them not producing a fertile offspring. Like, how come they're still able to produce fertile offspring? Is something that we can investigate, and we can see. I mean, is it just 100 genes, or how many number of gene mutations does need to happen in order for them not to breed successful fertile offspring, female offspring?
It seems you would need less than that, but I think the paper that I showed you it did cite that there were 100
Yeah,
known loci that accounted for the
yeah,
difference between the two cosmopolitan species.
yeah. No, but between simulants and the Mauritiana,
It was the two
for a
island
set of
species.
100 genetic alleles, not the same isolation prevailed between simulants and Madagascar. Yeah,
Okay, maybe I misremembered.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I would be super focused on this area in realizing the what I would reckon as scientific leads, not just observation, but scientific leads in determining the cause and effect, determining the cause and the actual gene mutation and the trajectory of those genetic mutations. I mean, even if they have been dropped off, like for example, they have been annihilated, right? um, you could say that millions of years, they it's not captured in the gene repertoire. Only the positive change got documented, and the paternal, the ancestral gene was just left out, just got dropped out or annihilated, which usually is not the case. Because if we look at some of the subspecies of, for example, coleocanths, they carry a large chunk of genome that's vestigial, for example. So
Coelacanths, you mean the fish?
yeah, the coelacanth fish,
Okay.
some of those carry large chunks in a repertoire of ancestral genomes, for example, right? If you want to argue from that side of the story. So I wouldn't necessarily grant it, but I can still grant it just to be a conciliatory, just to have this conciliatory approach in identifying what is evidence. But from what tells us of the different species and the genomes that they have, that they carry this historical repertoire with them, the vestigial repertoire. So that does entail that these diverging species should not lose their ancestral genetic loci, right? They should keep
I
it.
would
They
like
should
to make a
retain it.
clarification. I would like to grant you that the example you gave, I also do not believe that that is evidence. That would not be evidence for common descent. The only thing that that demonstrates is that there is no contradiction in that based on the genetics of the coelacanth. But I would grant you that that's not evidence, and that's not enough to make any kind of conclusion other than the coherence and logical conclusion, which is not evidence based.
So why wouldn't you argue that to be evidence of ancestral common ancestry?
What, just the fact that genes are the same? How is that evidence?
No,
Genes are the
the
same,
ancestral.
therefore what?
Okay, I mean, I'm taken by surprise, but yeah, I mean, I would agree with
I mean,
you
I mean,
from a design
I mean, so
philosophy.
what, right? Like, okay, fine, yeah, they have the same genes. What does that prove? It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
If you can
what?
tell me
Tell me,
how it would be evidence from my view, I mean, I don't see how it would be. It's just an observation. It doesn't mean anything.
yeah, but now, right now, I kind of get the sense that you kind of agree with me that we are actually lacking, I should say, we are actually lacking scientific evidence of tracking down speciation. Would you agree?
Well, I think absent the genetic distinction that I asked you to make, my position is still that we've established a genetic basis for speciation.
Hmm.
And again, we haven't talked about common descent yet, right? We've only talked about genetic speciation, and so that is one plank in the argument, right? So if I were to make an argument, that would be like premise one, that there is genetic speciation. We haven't even gotten to common descent yet. I'm just establishing as a precedent, as a premise that genetic speciation is true and it happens, right? So we haven't talked about common descent yet, or coelacanths, or genetic similarities, or any of that.
Okay, Ivo, I want to bring you back to this example that we had briefly chatted about in the last session. It's
Okay.
about the platypus. You did say
Ah,
that I'm making a prediction, online prediction, that platypus's beak's material is different. Can you expand on it and try to build your argument around it?
okay. Well, so you want to know why I would think that, basically? Why would I
Yeah,
predict this? Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So if you use monophyletic classification, and if you remember at the beginning of this stream, I gave you an example of how you can show that there is not a monophyletic ancestral relationship between, say, dogs and humans, right? So because there's no nested hierarchy where one is entailed by the other one, and the same is true for platypus and birds, for example. The only if platypus are related by common descent, it is only possible that they are a mammal, right? And I'm not saying that this is evidence that they're a mammal. I'm saying they can't be anything else, right? Based on monophyly. Now, because of that, this has logical entailments, right? If a platypus is a mammal, that means it can't be a bird in the same way that a human cannot come from a dog, right? So a platypus can't be a bird. And so if we show that it genetically has a nested hierarchy within birds, or that birds have a nested hierarchy within platypus, well, this would falsify the whole thing. You wouldn't be able to have that, right? And so this means, and so this has entailments. It means that the genetic loci for whatever is causing a beak on on a platypus has to be in a different location than it is for birds. It has to be a different sequence that is actually causing it than it is for birds. It has to be likely different in terms of the embryological difference, in terms of the embryological development between platypus and birds. There are all these differences you would expect to see if platypus evolved from mammals. Well, then they need to have mammal-like stages of development. They need to have mammal-like genetics, and any trait they have, which is superficially like some other clade, needs to be genetically different from that clade. And so that's why I made the prediction, because if evolution is true, if based on monophyly a platypus can't come from a bird, well, then it can't have these nested hierarchical traits from birds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, but don't you think there are possibilities that challenge that position?
Such as,
Such as, for example, another species of monotremes, because platypus gets classified under monotremes, that they're egg-laying mammals.
with with the echidna, yes.
Yeah, with echidna, but echidna does have a keratin base for a beak, unlike the platypus. So
What
that
is the platypus's beak made of?
platypus's beak is made of other material, non-keratin material.
That's actually kind of surprising. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Do you know what material it is? Is it like some like super like weird unique material or?
it's muscular in nature.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's got a bone
Well,
inside,
that's not the
but then
case.
the
Well, that's not the
projection.
case for bird beaks, right?
Yeah, I mean that sort of a classification of clade can be. I can grant you because you're coming up with that classification, but it's not the same for echidna. Echidna does have a keratin-based beak, but the platypus, it does have a bone, and then it protrudes over the bone with a muscular tissue
Okay.
that has electroreception in it.
Okay. So then this has entailments, and one entailment would be that it is not possible that the echidna and the platypus inherited their beaks from the same origin. Right,
Yeah,
you'd
but
have to entail that the genetic basis for their beaks would be different as well, just like the
yeah,
genetic
but
basis
that's
for
not what is
platypus and
being
birds are
talked
different.
about. I mean, from what I sort of got you on your prediction, that's what I told you. You were making a prediction, but that could be falsified because there are variations. And echidna, one of the monotremes, does have a keratin-based beak, just like a bird. And this is why, I mean, even monophyly can continually be updated. Like I mean, when we started off, like hundreds of years ago, Ibn Khaldun just started off giving a broad biodiversity tree of life, and then it sequentially got developed over the centuries, and we have developed it today, for example. But we cannot be certain about our uh, we cannot really freeze it. So there's always this gray zone that challenges our assumptions of our classification. And yeah, one of that is that the echidna does have a keratin based beak, which goes against your predictions that you were trying to make in the previous stream.
What are the genetics of the echidna beak? Did you look into that?
But it is, I mean, they both are classified under monotremes for sure. They are monotremes, egg-laying
Yeah.
mammals, because they ooze out milk from their glands.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
so the genetics of the echidna beak would also have to be different not only from bird beaks but also from platypus beaks. They would have to have different origins, all three of them separate.
yeah. I did not go into the details. I just wanted to because you made a point of this prediction to necessarily be true because based on monophyly. I just went and checked a few different things and I realized that was not the case. And
I'm not seeing how this contradicts what I said.
because you did say that the material of the beak has to be different, it can't be a bird beak.
It isn't a bird beak. How is it a bird beak?
An echidna beak is a bird beak. Like it's
No,
got the same
it's
material,
not.
keratin.
What are the genetics of the echidna beak, and how does it develop in the embryo?
I mean, you tell me.
I'm asking you. I don't know.
No, I didn't look into the details. All I looked at was the material. So the beak of the platypus certainly is different. Um, it's non-keratin based beak, but the
Okay.
beak of the echidna is a keratin based beak.
Okay, and what you would need to show is what are the genetics behind the echidna beak. I also wasn't even familiar that echidnas had beaks, so I'd have to look into that as well. So this could be something that I can table, right? I can look up
Sure.
echidnas.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so we'd have to establish a genetic. What is the genetics behind the echidna beak? We would have to establish what is the embryological development behind the echidna beak. We have to establish what are the proteins that are building the keratin and the echidna beak versus the proteins that are building it in a bird beak. Um,
Sure.
if these things are all the same, then that would be a problem for evolution.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I will also try and look it up. And
I actually didn't know that bird beaks were made of keratin because I'm pretty sure that like most mammal structures are also made of keratins. Like I'm pretty sure hair is made of
yeah.
keratin,
Yep.
nails are made of keratin, and so
Yep.
I actually didn't know that about bird beaks. I didn't know that it was keratin based
I mean, yeah. I mean, I will also look into
because it
more
seems to be the
detail into
case
this.
that seems to be the case that mammals commonly build structures out of keratin,
Mm.
and so and so therefore because I didn't know this, keratin wouldn't be a non-mammal derived trait since mammals commonly use keratin to make structures.
Yeah, I mean the feather and the fur, both of them, I think, have keratin as the base
Okay,
to
well, that
build.
makes sense. Okay, I didn't know that. So
So, I mean, I do understand that fur and feathers are classified as different monophyletic traits. So, feathers are classified as birds, and furs are classified as mammals, for example.
yeah,
But
well,
yeah, that could be,
I think scales of reptiles are also made out of keratin, aren't they?
yeah, possibly, possibly.
And and the in according to monophyly, both the feather and mammal hair are derived from reptile scales. So if those are all made of the same material, that would make sense.
Yeah, but then it would not be a monophyletic distinction anymore, or you could still use them as distinction based on the clades and
Yeah,
subclassification.
the material itself would not be a monophyletic distinction, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so you wouldn't be able to use material to say that something isn't a mammal or isn't a bird if they're both using the same material, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when I made that prediction, I didn't know that they use the same material
Yeah.
to like basically make everything,
Yeah.
right? Like basically
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
every structure that they have is made of the same material. I didn't know
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. So
since that's the case,
it might more so be a phylogenetic kind of argument. Like what is the material
yes,
actually making? It's making a feather. It's making a hair. It's making a scale, or what is it actually making? A very an anatomical variation basically that's observable would be a
it would also
distinction there.
be a genetic argument and an embryological argument.
Yeah, yeah, that would obviously be the case
Yeah.
because those elements have to be built. That's not
Yeah.
in a
Because
ancestral repertoire, for example.
because because from a monophyly perspective, if right, because we define monophyly as the traits that they exclusively have in common. Well, if reptiles, birds, and mammals all exclusively share this trait, well, then you can't use that trait as a monophyletic distinction between any of them, right? Right,
Gotcha.
you can't define mammal, for instance, on the basis of keratin if other things that are monophyletic that it is monophyletically embedded in are also keratin based. Um,
Hmm.
so
Hmm. Let me just Google that out immediately here and see if that's the case.
may I ask what you're googling?
The scales,
Or
feathers,
scales made of keratin?
hair,
Or are you
beaks.
asking if they're monophyletic?
Of no keratin, keratin. Just to be sure. Yes, the scales, feathers, hair, beaks are all primarily made of keratin. Keratin is a type of
Okay,
fibrous structural protein that provides strength and protection to these
perfect.
structures in various animals. Yeah.
Yeah, so okay, so then yeah, it wouldn't be an entailment of monophyly that you could use the material then in that case.
Yeah. But it yeah, I think yeah, they just need to expand the definition of why they classify mammals to not have feathers. Just because feather has a structured arrangement of those hair with a stem that holds the
Ultimately,
hair together.
ultimately the justification would be genetic. So the genetics of the
Mm,
hair would be different from the genetics of the feather.
mm, okay.
So yeah, so basically the genetics of the feather and the genetics of the hair would have to have the same commonalities that both have with scales.
Okay. And the genetics of the beak that echidna has would necessarily be different from the genetics of the beaks of the birds, right?
And also different from the genetics of the platypus.
I mean, it need not be different from platypus because they're both classified as monotremes. But from what we see, it is different. But
The basis for classifying them as monotremes or mammals is not on the basis of the beak. The beak would be a modern or derived trait, which is secondary to their mammal or monotreme status.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. So it need not be different between the two. It can be the same, but from the looks of it, it is different. The reason why they have to be different from the birds is because they're not birds. So what would be the genetic difference that you would look at um, between echidna and the birds to be different? What sort of genetic difference are you looking at?
In terms of the loci, for one, so it would be possibly even on a different chromosome, for example. It might not even be on the same chromosome. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be on a different chromosome, but if it is on a different chromosome, then this would immediately make my case. Doesn't have to be, but if it was, then that would be strong evidence. It could also just have any different genetic loci. So if it's just not the same gene, like it's literally just a different gene that is causing it, um, and you can actually show that um, on the theory that the genetic differences between two individuals is caused by mutations, you would be able to show that the mutations responsible for the echidna beak are they have a different loci than the mutations responsible for a bird beak. You would also be able to show. Oh, there was one more thing I was thinking of, and it wasn't pertaining to embryological development. It was pertaining to genetics. Um, yeah, so I would predict that not only are the loci different, but the actual sequence that is responsible for building a beak would also be different. So not only is it on a different location of the chromosome, or even possibly on an entirely different chromosome, but that the actual sequence of genes which cause that trait would be different.
Mm.
That where it would only where so basically um, the it wouldn't be able to be explainable by them having a monophyletically sameness to their beaks. They would have to have um, in the evolutionary review, there would have to be mutational differences between the beaks.
Okay, I mean, I will table that down as well to research. But if they are not different, then you would reckon that would be a problem for evolution, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Let me table this down, and I'll do more on my end. So you know that I'm working, right? After I've spoken to you, I'm working, right?
What? Oh, okay. Okay. What do
No,
you mean
no.
you're
What I'm
working?
asking you is, you now realize that I'm actually working after I've spoken to you. I'm not taking this for granted, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You're actually
yeah.
working. Okay.
Because I've written a book. Obviously, knowledge advances, and when I wrote the book 7 years ago, I had many arguments. Many of my arguments are still valid in my book. So I basically I go back to my book and I look for arguments, and then I do more research now. But all this actually provokes me to provide another edition to my book, which I might
Okay.
do in the future. But yeah.
That's exciting. I'm honored.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I mean, anything. I mean, I don't treat knowledge for peanuts. I mean, it's important. It
I would make you a bet, and this is not a scientific prediction, but this is a bet that I would make. If you wrote a book and you demonstrated um, the genetic basis that I'm talking about for the difference between the echidna and the bird doesn't exist, I think you would draw real attention from evolutionary biologists, and they would actually like try to respond to you and seek you out and address it.
I mean,
If you
certainly I would
demonstrate
go on.
that, I think real biologists will take a keen interest in you.
Yeah, I mean, the last statement that you just said to me, can you please write something for me on my email so I can always keep that as a reference and I can go back to it and I can refer to it?
You mean my criteria for demonstrating that the echidna beak and the bird beak are
No, no,
or are
no.
not
The
monophyletic?
statement you just made, what my book should include to get an real attention from a biologist.
Oh, it was that. If you demonstrate that the echidna genetics for beaks are the same as the genetics for bird beaks, I believe, and this is just a belief, right? Like I could be wrong, but I believe that you would get real attention from real biologists.
I think that's what I've done
Help
in
with
my
that.
book. Okay, to be honest with you, that's what I've done in my book. All right.
Well, if you have, then yeah, congratulations to you.
But now I'll have to see. Now I'll have to go and actually see if there has been echidna genome sequenced and it's all mapped up, so we can have some
It
evidence to
probably
look at
has,
it and
just
see.
because monotremes are so unique. It's probably
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. Probably has.
evolutionary
Yeah.
biologists are
So
probably very interested in the genetics of
yeah,
the echidna, so it
yeah,
probably has
yeah.
been.
So just it's only a matter that I'll go and investigate that further, and of course you can do it on your side as well, and we can share, what comes about,
But yeah,
and
if yeah, so
we can
I
see.
can promise you this, like if you show me that, I would have no answer to you, and so I would actually try to go to an actual biologist and show them what you found and ask them for an explanation because I would not be able to provide one myself if that was the
Mm,
case.
mm, Yeah, I mean, yeah, brilliant conversation, and we are head. It seems like we are heading somewhere now.
Yeah,
So
now I think I like that we structured it this way this time. I think this was a much more productive conversation than the last one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not here to win or lose an argument or whatever it is. I can lose an argument, but what I can't really lose is my volition to to embrace the new evidence. I can't lose that. So
Oh,
if
good.
there is evidence, there is evidence, and I can't be blind to that. So
Yeah. Yeah. So we're coming up on a couple hours here, so we'll probably wrap it up on that note. I think that's a good note to wrap it up on.
yeah,
Um,
certainly is. And I'm
some
delighted to talk to you, Ivo. And I wanted to ask you this: how many views did your channel generate on the previous video?
Oh, not very many. I think this one I'm actually gonna promote it in a few places, and this one will get more views than the last one. Last one
Okay,
was
the
not
last
very
one
hot, but
on my channel it got 99 views,
oh, that's not bad. Were there any comments on
and
that
it
one?
got like a watch time hour of 9.8 hours, like 10 hours worth of watching.
It's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. So yeah, I mean it's not bad at all. And this particular one, okay, this particular one so far we have 7 viewers. So yeah, I mean, I am making a lot more content on my channel. I mean, if you have noticed, there's a lot more variety on my channel, and eventually these videos will have a larger reception, especially if we continue to roll down this pathway of interacting like this and figuring out evidence, hard evidence,
I
about
think it's good
evolution or
content, so
against evolution. Yes.
I hope so.
Yeah, yeah. I'm delighted, Ivo, to speak to you. You're a good individual. You're a nice man, and I hope we can continue to talk like this in the future and figure out what evidence there is.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, and likewise.
You have a good day,
Um,
Ivo, and blessings. We'll
sure.
catch up next week.
All right. Have a good one.